The Taos hum, a sound only. Some people can hear. In the small town of Taos, New Mexico, surrounded by desert landscape and mountains that have witnessed centuries of human habitation, a percentage of the population hears something that shouldn't be there. They describe it as a low-frequency hum, persistent and maddening, like a distant diesel engine idling or heavy machinery running somewhere just beyond perception's reach. It doesn't come from any identifiable source. It doesn't stop. And most unsettling of all, only some people can hear it, while others, standing in the same location at the same time, hear absolutely nothing. The phenomenon has been investigated by scientists, studied by universities, examined for environmental and technological sources, yet no definitive explanation has emerged. The Taos hum remains, both a physical experience for those who perceive it, and a mystery that suggests our understanding of sound, perception, and possibly reality itself might be incomplete. The reports began surfacing prominently in the early 1990s, though some residents claim the sound existed earlier and simply wasn't discussed widely. Those who hear it describe a frequency that seems to be around 50 to 60 hertz, in the bass range at the very edge of human hearing. It's not loud in the conventional sense, but it's intrusive, penetrating, impossible to ignore once noticed. People report that it's often worse at night, stronger indoors than outdoors, and sometimes accompanied by physical sensations: vibration in the chest, pressure in the ears, headaches, difficulty sleeping. For some, it's merely annoying. For others, it becomes debilitating, driving them to desperation, to soundproofing their homes, to moving away from Taos, entirely seeking relief that may or may not come. What makes the Taos hum particularly mysterious is its selectivity. Approximately 2% of Taos residents report hearing it consistently. That's enough people that it can't be dismissed as isolated cases of tinnitus or psychological issues. But it's few enough that the majority experience nothing unusual. Researchers brought in sensitive audio equipment trying to record the sound, and in most cases detected nothing out of the ordinary. Some recordings did pick up low-frequency anomalies, but these were inconsistent, didn't correlate clearly with when hearers reported the sound being strongest, and weren't definitively identified as the source of the hum. Theories about the origin proliferate precisely because conventional explanations keep failing to account for all the observations. Industrial sources were investigated first. Ventilation systems, power plants, machinery of any kind that might produce low-frequency noise. Taos doesn't have significant heavy industry, but nearby facilities and infrastructure were examined anyway. None could be conclusively linked to the hum, and shutting down various potential sources didn't stop the sound for those who hear it. Military installations exist in New Mexico, leading to speculation about classified testing or equipment. But the hum predates most modern installations and continues regardless of military activity levels. Some researchers have proposed that the hum is generated by natural geological processes. The region sits on complex geology with faults, underground water systems, and rock formations that might vibrate or resonate under certain conditions. Microseismic activity, movements too small to register as earthquakes but constant at deep levels, could theoretically produce infrasound, frequencies below normal human hearing range, that some individuals somehow perceive. The problem with this explanation is that geological activity doesn't explain why only certain people hear it, why it would be stronger indoors, or why it follows patterns related to time of day, rather than correlating with measurable seismic data. The selectivity of who hears the hum suggests the answer might lie in human physiology rather than environmental sound. Perhaps certain individuals have sensitivity to frequencies or vibrations that most people's auditory systems filter out. Variations in inner ear structure, differences in how the brain processes sensory input, or sensitivity to electromagnetic fields that somehow translate into perceived sound could explain why only a subset of the population experiences the phenomenon. This would make the hum real in the sense that people genuinely perceive it, but generated internally, rather than by an external acoustic source. However, many hearers report that the sound has directionality, that it seems to come from a specific location or direction, which argues against purely internal generation. Electromagnetic fields have been proposed as a potential cause, with some researchers suggesting that people might be responding to power lines, radio transmissions, or other electromagnetic sources in ways that manifest as perceived sound. The theory holds that electromagnetic radiation could stimulate the auditory nerve directly or interact with the body in ways that create the sensation of hearing. This would explain why the hum is selective. Only those with particular sensitivity would perceive it, and why it doesn't show up on standard acoustic recordings. The correlation with indoor versus outdoor hearing might relate to how electromagnetic fields interact with building materials. Yet comprehensive electromagnetic surveys of Taos haven't identified sources that match the reported characteristics of the hum. There are darker theories, of course, that move beyond conventional physics and biology. Some believe the hum is deliberately generated, a byproduct or intentional feature of classified military research into acoustic weapons, mind control technology, or communication systems operating on frequencies meant to be undetectable. Projects like HAARP, though officially focused on ionospheric research, have attracted speculation about capabilities related to electromagnetic manipulation and low-frequency transmission. Could facilities conducting such research produce effects that sensitive individuals perceive hundreds of miles away? Could the hum be an unintended side effect of technology, operating just outside normal sensory range, detectable only by those whose perception extends slightly beyond the typical human baseline? The phenomenon isn't unique to Taos. Similar hums have been reported in other locations around the world. Bristol in England, Bondi in Australia, Windsor in Ontario, various locations in Europe and Asia. Each location has its own characteristics, its own percentage of affected population, its own failed investigations, and unresolved questions. The global nature of the phenomenon suggests either multiple independent sources producing similar effects, or a single type of source that exists in various locations. If it's technological, that implies widespread deployment of whatever generates the effect. If it's natural, it suggests geological or atmospheric conditions that occur in disparate places but produce consistent perceptual results for sensitive individuals. One of the more unsettling aspects reported by some hum hearers is that the sound seems intelligent or purposeful, as if it carries information or serves a function beyond mere noise. They describe patterns in the hum, variations in intensity or tone, that feel meaningful even if they can't decode them. This perception could be the mind's tendency to find patterns in random data, the same process that makes us see faces in clouds or hear words in white noise. Or it could suggest that whatever generates the hum, whether technological or natural, does operate in patterns that some part of human consciousness recognizes even without understanding. The psychological impact on those who hear the hum continuously is significant and well documented. Chronic exposure to inescapable low-frequency sound, whether objectively measurable or perceptually real for the individual, causes stress, sleep disruption, anxiety, and in severe cases, complete disruption of normal life. Some hearers become obsessed with finding the source, conducting their own investigations, measuring and recording, trying to convince others that what they experience is real and external. The frustration of having a sensory experience that others can't validate, or that technology can't consistently detect, creates a kind of isolation, a sense that you're perceiving something real that the rest of the world is blind to. Government studies have been conducted, most notably by the University of New Mexico in the mid-1990s, commissioned specifically to investigate the Taos hum. Researchers interviewed affected individuals, conducted acoustic measurements, reviewed potential sources in the area, and analyzed the characteristics reported by hearers. Their conclusion was inconclusive. They confirmed that people were genuinely experiencing something, that the reports were consistent enough to indicate a real phenomenon, rather than mass delusion. But they couldn't identify the source. The study essentially validated that the mystery exists while failing to solve it, which is perhaps the most honest conclusion given the evidence, but the least satisfying for those seeking answers or relief. Some researchers have explored whether the hum relates to tinnitus, a condition where people hear sounds generated within their own auditory system. However, tinnitus typically presents as ringing, buzzing, or hissing at higher frequencies, not the low drone that characterizes the hum. Additionally, tinnitus sufferers generally recognize that the sound originates internally, while hum hearers consistently describe it as external, with location and directionality. The phenomenological difference suggests these are distinct experiences, though they might share some underlying mechanisms related to auditory processing. The connection between the hum and location is another puzzling element. Some people report that the hum stops when they travel away from Taos, then returns when they come back, suggesting a geographically localized source. Others report hearing similar sounds in different locations, or that the hum followed them when they moved, suggesting the source is either widespread or that their sensitivity persists regardless of location. These contradictory accounts make it difficult to develop a unified theory. Perhaps multiple phenomena are being grouped under the label of the hum, each with different causes but similar perceptual characteristics. There's also the temporal aspect to consider. Hearers report that the hum isn't constant throughout the day, that it has patterns, times when it's stronger or weaker, periods when it disappears entirely. If the source were geological or related to permanent infrastructure, you'd expect more consistency. The variation suggests either a source that operates intermittently, sensitivity that fluctuates based on the hearer's physiological state, or interaction between multiple factors that align only at certain times. Some have tracked these patterns, noting correlations with power grid usage, atmospheric conditions, or even phases of the moon, though none of these correlations have been strong enough to be definitive. The question of why this phenomenon seems to have increased in recent decades also invites speculation. Are more people hearing it because the source has intensified or spread? Are we simply more aware and likely to report unusual experiences now that internet communication allows people to share and validate their perceptions? Or has modern technology introduced new sources of electromagnetic fields, low-frequency vibrations, or environmental factors that human sensitivity responds to in ways we're only beginning to recognize? The proliferation of wireless communication, the expansion of electrical infrastructure, changes in how we use and transmit energy. All of these represent relatively recent developments in human history that might have perceptual consequences we haven't fully mapped. For those who hear the Taos hum, theories and speculation matter less than the immediate reality of their experience. The sound is there, persistent and maddening, affecting their quality of life, their sleep, their sense of well-being. Whether it originates from military technology, geological processes, electromagnetic fields, or some aspect of their own neurology, the effect is real, and the lack of definitive answers provides no relief. They live with a sensory experience that most people can't validate, that science can't consistently measure, that has no clear source and no reliable solution. In a way, they exist in a different perceptual reality than their neighbors, hearing something that's either there for everyone but only perceptible to the sensitive, or generated through some process unique to their own consciousness and physiology. The Taos hum remains unsolved, a localized but globally recognized phenomenon that sits at the intersection of acoustics, physiology, psychology, and possibly physics we don't fully understand. It raises fundamental questions about the nature of perception, about whether reality is objective or experiential, about what exists beyond the normal range of human senses, and what it means when some individuals perceive things others don't. The hum continues for those who hear it, a constant reminder that there are mysteries in even the most ordinary places, sounds in the silence that only certain ears can detect, and that our understanding of how we perceive the world around us might be far more limited and far more strange than we typically assume. The Paul Amadeus Dienach chronicles a man who woke up in the future. In 1921, a Swiss-Austrian teacher named Paul Amadeus Dienach fell into a year-long coma after complications from tuberculosis. When he woke in 1922, he appeared physically recovered but psychologically transformed in ways his doctors couldn't explain. He began writing obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with detailed accounts of what he claimed to have experienced during his unconscious year, except he hadn't experienced nothing or darkness or the blank void that coma patients typically report. According to Dienach, his consciousness had left his body in 1921 and woken up in the body of another man, living in the year 3096 AD, over 1,000 years in the future. For that entire year, while his physical body lay comatose in a hospital bed in Geneva, his awareness had been living a future life, experiencing a world that humanity wouldn't reach for another millennium, learning about technologies and social structures and historical events that hadn't happened yet, but that he now remembered as if he'd lived through them. When his consciousness returned to his own time and his own body, he was left with complete memories of that future year, knowledge of what would happen to humanity over the next 1,000 years, and the burden of information he couldn't prove, and that most people would dismiss as elaborate delusion or fever dream, rather than genuine temporal displacement of consciousness into a future reality. Dienach knew he was dying. The tuberculosis that had caused his coma would kill him within a few years, and he had no time to waste trying to convince skeptics that his experience was real. Instead, he focused on documenting everything he'd learned, writing detailed journals about the future he'd witnessed, describing it in terms his 20th century perspective could understand, while struggling with concepts and technology so advanced that he lacked the vocabulary to properly articulate what he'd seen. The journals described a world utterly transformed from his own time. No more nations in the way he understood them. No wars or conflicts of the type that had recently torn Europe apart in World War I. A global civilization that had transcended many of the problems that plagued humanity in Dienach's era. But the path to that future was anything but peaceful, and the knowledge he brought back included warnings about catastrophes and transformations that humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. Before his death in 1924, Dienach entrusted his journals to his student in Greece, George Papachatzis, asking him to translate them from German to Greek and to share the knowledge with those who might understand its significance. Papachatzis initially thought the journals were a novel, an elaborate science fiction work his teacher had been writing. Only after Dienach's death did Papachatzis discover the claim that the contents were actual memories from the future rather than fiction. He spent decades studying the journals, eventually publishing them in Greece in 1972, under the title Valley of the Roses, where they became underground classics in Greek metaphysical circles, while remaining almost unknown in the broader world. The text described in extraordinary detail a future history spanning from Dinak's time to the year 3096, covering wars and technological revolutions and social transformations that would reshape humanity completely, culminating in a society that had achieved what Dinak could only describe as a higher state of consciousness, where humans had evolved beyond their current limitations into something greater. The future Dinak described began with darkness before reaching enlightenment. The 20th century would be catastrophic. He foresaw another world war even more devastating than the first, conflicts that would threaten human survival, technologies emerging that could destroy civilization. The 20th and 21st centuries were periods of crisis where humanity teetered on the edge of extinction through nuclear weapons, environmental collapse, and social breakdown. But somehow, civilization survived these trials, and in the centuries following, humanity began to transform. The nation-state system collapsed, replaced by global governance that actually worked because it emerged organically from necessity, rather than being imposed by conquest. Technology advanced to points where material scarcity became obsolete, where energy was abundant and clean, where disease and aging were controllable, if not entirely eliminated. But the most significant transformation wasn't technological. It was consciousness itself. Dinak described that somewhere around the year 2400, humanity underwent what the people of the future called the Great Realization, a species-wide shift in awareness where large numbers of people began to experience consciousness differently, to perceive reality in ways that transcended normal sensory experience, to access information and states of being that previous generations would have considered supernatural or impossible. This wasn't religious rapture or mystical ascension, but rather an evolutionary development, the next stage in human consciousness that had been latent in the species, and that environmental conditions and deliberate efforts finally activated. By the time Dinak's consciousness arrived in 3096, this enhanced consciousness was normal, and he found himself in a body and society where people could do things with their minds that would seem like magic to 20th century humans. The society of 3096 operated on principles that Dinak struggled to explain to his contemporary readers. Work as he knew it didn't exist. Automation and advanced technology handled material production, and humans engaged in pursuits that were creative, exploratory, and developmental, rather than subsistence-focused. Education consumed decades of each person's life, not because they were learning job skills, but because they were developing consciousness and capacity, becoming more than their baseline human nature allowed. People lived centuries rather than decades, their bodies maintained by technologies and practices that Dinak couldn't fully comprehend, but that had turned aging into a manageable condition rather than an inevitable decline toward death. Government as Dinak knew it was absent. There was global coordination and decision-making, but it functioned through consensus and shared consciousness rather than through representatives and voting. When humanity needed to make collective decisions, those with developed consciousness could merge awareness temporarily, accessing a form of group mind that allowed understanding of all perspectives simultaneously, making decisions that reflected genuine collective will rather than majority overriding minority. This social technology, this ability to temporarily unify consciousness for decision-making, eliminated many of the conflicts that plagued earlier eras because decisions weren't made by forcing one group's will on another, but by finding solutions that actually integrated everyone's needs and perspectives. Crime and violence were essentially non-existent, not because of punishment or enforcement, but because the consciousness shift had altered human nature at a fundamental level. The drives that created conflict, territorial aggression, resource competition, status anxiety, had been transcended or redirected into channels that didn't harm others. People still had individual desires and goals, but the framework in which they pursued them had changed so dramatically that behaviors Dianak's era considered inevitable. Parts of human nature simply didn't occur anymore. Murder, theft, assault. These belonged to humanity's past, to the consciousness state that people in 3096 had evolved beyond. Dianak described being treated as a medical curiosity during his time in the future. The man whose body he'd woken into had been in a coma, and when Dianak's consciousness from the past animated it, the people of the future realized something extraordinary had occurred. A consciousness from 1,000 years ago, years earlier, had somehow projected forward through time and inhabited one of their contemporaries. They studied him gently, interviewed him about his era, and helped him understand theirs, treating the situation as a rare opportunity to understand humanity's past through someone who'd actually lived it. They were kind, but also somewhat horrified by what Dianak told them about the 20th century, about the wars and poverty and limited consciousness that characterized his time. From their perspective, he was from humanity's dark age, from the period before the transformation, and his memories confirmed how far they'd come from that primitive state. The people of 3096 had access to historical records from all eras, but they understood that recorded history distorts and simplifies, that having someone present who actually experienced the past provided insight that documents couldn't capture. They asked Dianak about emotional states, about how it felt to live in a world of nations and wars, about what consciousness was like before the Great Realization. His answers apparently filled gaps in their understanding of their own history, confirmed some things, and contradicted others, gave them personal testimony about an era they knew intellectually, but couldn't fully comprehend experientially. The question of how Dianak's consciousness traveled through time was never fully answered to his satisfaction. The people of the future theorized that his near-death state during the coma had somehow freed his consciousness from its normal temporal anchoring, allowing it to drift forward along his timeline to a point where a suitable vessel, the comatose man in 3096, was available to receive it. This kind of temporal consciousness displacement was rare, but not unknown to them. They had records of similar cases throughout history, instances where consciousness seemed to slip between times, during states of profound physical distress or transition. They couldn't control or replicate the phenomenon, couldn't send him back deliberately, but they understood it as a natural, if uncommon, occurrence when consciousness became untethered from the body. When Dianak's year in the future ended, when his consciousness returned to his own time and body in 1922, the transition was instantaneous from his perspective. One moment, he was in 3096. The next, he was opening his eyes in a Geneva hospital with doctors and nurses celebrating his emergence from the coma. But he brought back memories of an entire year lived in the future, knowledge of humanity's trajectory, awareness of what was coming and what humanity would have to survive before reaching the enlightened state he'd witnessed. The burden of this knowledge was immense because he had no way to prove it, no way to demonstrate that his experiences were genuine rather than elaborate coma dreams or neurological misfiring. The journals he wrote were his attempt to preserve the knowledge, to leave a record that might be useful to future generations, even if his own contemporaries dismissed him as delusional. He described technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries, social structures that would seem impossible to people in the 1920s, evolutionary developments in human consciousness that his era had no framework to understand. The text is remarkable for its consistency and detail, for the coherence of the future world it describes, for the careful thought given to how society would function under conditions so different from the 20th century baseline. Skeptics point out that Dianac's future is suspiciously utopian, reflecting the hopes and dreams that someone from the aftermath of World War I might project onto a distant future rather than realistic prediction of how humanity would develop. The absence of specific technological details that could be verified, the focus on social and consciousness developments that are unfalsifiable, the convenient fact that most of what he describes wouldn't occur until long after anyone reading the journals would be alive to check, all suggest that the journals are either conscious fiction or elaborate confabulation produced by a damaged brain during extended unconsciousness, rather than genuine memories from the future. But defenders of Dianac's authenticity note elements of his account that don't fit the standard wishful thinking pattern. He doesn't describe the future as perfect. There are still challenges and conflicts, just operating at higher levels than his era understood. He includes warnings about catastrophes that humanity would face, some of which seemed implausible when he wrote them, but that subsequent history has made more credible. His description of the Great Realization as an evolutionary shift in consciousness, rather than religious salvation or technological transcendence, is unusual for his era, more aligned with concepts from Eastern philosophy and modern consciousness studies than with the prevailing Western religious or materialist frameworks of the 1920s. The question of whether human consciousness can actually travel through time, whether Dianac genuinely experienced what he described, or whether the journals represent elaborate fiction or trauma-induced hallucination, can't be definitively answered unless the future he described actually arrives and can be compared to his account. We're still centuries away from 3096, still experiencing the early stages of the trajectory he outlined, unable to confirm or deny the specific details of the society he claimed to witness. But some elements of his account have proven prescient. He foresaw global governance emerging from necessity, technological developments that would transform society, consciousness research becoming legitimate science rather than dismissed mysticism. Whether these are lucky guesses or genuine memories from a future he actually visited remains contested. The journals remain obscure outside Greece, never achieving widespread attention in the English-speaking world despite their remarkable content. They exist in a liminal space between fiction and prophecy, between dismissed curiosity and potentially significant testimony about humanity's future. For those who believe Dianac actually experienced what he described, the journals are a roadmap showing where humanity is headed, the trials we'll face, and the transformation awaiting us if we survive. For skeptics, they're interesting science fiction written by a dying man with tuberculosis who spent a year in a coma and emerged with damaged cognition that produced elaborate false memories he genuinely believed were real. What makes the Dianac Chronicles different from other claims of time travel or prophetic vision is the specific mechanism, not physical time travel or mystical revelation, but consciousness displacement during coma, a phenomenon that, if possible, wouldn't require exotic physics or divine intervention, but rather represents an edge case of consciousness studies, a rare occurrence when awareness becomes untethered from its normal temporal position. If consciousness isn't strictly produced by the brain, but rather filtered or focused through it, then damage to the brain or near-death states might temporarily release consciousness from its usual constraints, allowing it to drift temporally before reconnecting to the body when physical conditions stabilize. This framework makes Dianac's claim slightly more plausible than traditional time travel stories because it doesn't require paradoxes or machinery or violation of causality. His consciousness observed the future but couldn't change it, couldn't interact in ways that would create grandfather paradoxes or bootstrap paradoxes. He was a passive observer experiencing a year of the future through a borrowed body before returning to his own time with memories that he then spent his remaining years documenting. The future continued on its predetermined path, unaffected by his visit, and the past remained unchanged except for one man gaining knowledge he couldn't prove, and that would mostly die with him except for journals that would reach limited circulation decades after his death. The prophecy or prediction aspect is where the journals become testable, though on timescales that make verification difficult. Dienach describes specific developments in coming centuries, when certain transformations would occur. What events would mark turning points in human history? How consciousness evolution would manifest? As time passes and we move through the centuries he documented, his account will either be validated or falsified. If the Great Realization happens around 2400 as he described, if society develops along the trajectories he outlined, if the specific markers he mentioned appear when he said they would, then the probability that he actually experienced what he claimed increases dramatically. If instead human history diverges completely from his account, the journals remain fascinating fiction or delusion, but lose credibility as genuine testimony from the future. Paul Amadeus Dienach died in 1924, 3 years after his coma, and 2 years after documenting his alleged future memories. He never lived to see any of his predictions come true or be falsified. He never witnessed the Second World War he'd foreseen, never knew whether humanity would survive the 20th century crises he'd described, never learned whether his student would even translate and share the journals, or whether the knowledge would be lost. He died with certainty that he'd experienced something extraordinary, with memories of a year lived 1,000 years in the future, with knowledge of where humanity was headed if it could survive the journey, and with the burden of being unable to prove any of it to a world that would mostly dismiss him as confused or mentally damaged by his year-long coma. The journals remain preserved in Greek translation, available to those curious enough to seek them out, describing a future that's either genuine memories from consciousness displaced through time, or the elaborate imaginings of a dying man's damaged brain creating meaning from chaos during extended unconsciousness. They describe humanity transcending its current limitations, evolving into something greater, surviving catastrophes that would threaten extinction, and ultimately achieving a state of consciousness in society that seems impossibly utopian from our current vantage point. But that Dienach insisted he'd witnessed firsthand, that he'd lived in for a year, that he'd experienced with the same visceral reality that any of us experience our daily lives. Whether he actually did, whether consciousness can travel through time, whether his journals are testimony or fiction, prophecy or delusion, won't be definitively known until the future he described either arrives as he documented it or fails to materialize, until humanity either undergoes the great realization he witnessed or remains forever trapped in consciousness, states that he characterized as primitive and limited compared to what we're capable of becoming, until 3096 arrives and we discover whether the world that exists then bears any resemblance to the world that Paul Amadeus Dienach claimed to have visited during his year-long coma in 1921. When his consciousness allegedly left his dying body and woke up in the far future, living in tomorrow for 365 days, before returning to his own time with memories that would die with him. Except for the journals, except for the chronicle of the future written by a man who claimed he'd been there, who insisted until his death that he'd seen what was coming, who documented humanity's future for anyone willing to consider that maybe, impossibly, a man in a coma really can wake up in the future and return with knowledge of what awaits us. Knowledge that sits in those journals, waiting to be proven true or false by the only test that matters. The passage of time itself carrying humanity forward toward the year 3096, when we'll finally know whether Paul Amadeus Dienach really did wake up in the future, or whether he was just a dying man dreaming of what might be, hoping for transformation, imagining enlightenment, and leaving behind a testament to either genuine temporal consciousness displacement or to humanity's eternal desire to believe that we're destined for something greater than what we currently are, that the future holds transcendence rather than extinction, that if we can just survive the trials ahead, we'll become something remarkable, something he claimed he'd already seen waiting for us 1,000 years from now. The sleepwalkers, people who vanish and return with no memory. They leave their homes in the middle of the night, walking outdoors they unlock without waking, moving through streets with eyes that don't quite see, traveling distances that shouldn't be possible in the time that passes. Sometimes they're found miles away, standing in places they've never been before, with no shoes on their feet and no memory of how they got there. Sometimes they're gone for hours, for days, and when they return or are discovered, their minds hold nothing of the journey. No recollection of walking, no memory of the time that passed. Just a gap, a void where hours or days of their life should be, and a terrible sense that something happened during that missing time, something they were made to forget, or something they're better off not remembering. These are the sleepwalkers, and what makes them different from ordinary somnambulism, from the medical condition where people move during sleep, is the distance they travel, the things they do while absent, and the disturbing evidence that something is calling them, pulling them out of their homes and their lives with purpose that remains hidden from their conscious minds. The phenomenon has been documented for centuries, but has intensified in recent decades. Or perhaps we're simply more aware of it now, that surveillance systems and cell phone tracking make disappearances harder to ignore. A woman in her 30s leaves her apartment in Chicago at 2 a.m, security footage showing her walk to the elevator in her pajamas, barefoot, moving with the slow, deliberate gait characteristic of someone deeply asleep. She exits the building, walks 4 blocks, and then simply vanishes from camera coverage. 16 hours later, she's found in a field 40 miles outside the city, lying in wet grass, her feet torn and bleeding from walking on pavement, and then rough ground, with no memory of anything after going to bed the previous night. She doesn't remember leaving her apartment, doesn't remember the walk, doesn't remember the missing 16 hours. Medical examination finds her exhausted, dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. Blood tests show nothing unusual. Brain scans reveal no abnormalities. She's a completely normal person who somehow walked 40 miles while unconscious and has no idea why. What separates these cases from standard sleepwalking is the complexity of behavior. Sleepwalkers typically move through familiar environments, navigating their homes or immediate surroundings in automatic patterns. They might walk to the kitchen, might even perform simple tasks, but they don't usually leave the house, don't navigate traffic, don't travel miles through complicated urban geography, requiring dozens of decisions and course corrections. The sleepwalkers do all of this while appearing to be in some kind of trance state, moving with purpose, but without conscious awareness. They unlock doors, sometimes using keys or security codes they need to remember. They walk or sometimes drive, operating vehicles successfully enough to avoid accidents while having no memory of being behind the wheel. They reach destinations that seem to have significance, even though they can't consciously explain why they went there. The destinations themselves are often strange and troubling, isolated locations with no obvious connection to the person's life, fields or forests far from urban areas, abandoned buildings, locations near water, lakes, rivers, coastlines, with the sleepwalker found standing at the water's edge as if they arrived at their intended destination and then simply stopped, waiting for something that never came or that did come but left no memory of its presence. Some are found in places that are actively dangerous, on cliff edges or train tracks, in positions that suggest they were brought to the very brink of death and then abandoned before the final step. What makes families and investigators most uneasy is when the sleepwalker is found in impossible locations. A man vanishes from his rural home in Oregon and is discovered 24 hours later in a Nevada desert, over 400 miles away. He has no car, no money, no explanation for how he covered that distance. A teenager disappears from her bedroom on the second floor of a house where the windows were locked and is found the next morning in a park 6 miles away, with no evidence she ever left through a door or window that could be opened from inside. The physics and logistics don't work. The distances are too great, the time too short, the access points too secure. Yet the people are gone and then found, and their minds hold nothing but blankness where the explanation should be. Some sleepwalkers are never found or are found too late. Missing person cases where the individual simply walked away from their life in the middle of the night and never returned. Bodies discovered in remote locations weeks or months later. Cause of death: exposure or dehydration, with evidence suggesting the person walked there purposefully, but with no indication of why. These cases blend into statistics, get categorized as accidents or suicides, but family members and investigators sometimes notice patterns. The person left their home in night clothes. They bypassed multiple opportunities to get help or turn back. They moved toward a destination they had no known connection to, as if being guided or compelled by something that overrode their survival instincts and conscious will. There are also disturbing reports of what some sleepwalkers do during their episodes, activity that's too complex, too purposeful to be explained by unconscious wandering. A woman with no technical knowledge is found in her garage, disassembling electronic devices with tools she doesn't remember knowing how to use. A man wakes up in his car parked outside a house he's never visited, with a notebook in his lap filled with writing he doesn't remember producing, symbols and diagrams that mean nothing to his conscious mind, but were drawn with precision and apparent understanding. Children are found in rooms they never entered while awake, playing with toys arranged in patterns that seem to have meaning, speaking words in their sleep that adults later realize might be coordinates or codes. The phenomenon seems to run in families sometimes, suggesting possible genetic component. Multiple members across generations experiencing episodes where they vanish and return with missing time. But it also appears to cluster in certain locations, areas where multiple unrelated people have experienced sleepwalker episodes over years. Is there something about these places, electromagnetic anomalies, geological formations, proximity to facilities or installations, that triggers the phenomenon? Or are people in these areas being deliberately targeted by something that requires them to be in specific locations at specific times, using their bodies for purposes that leave no trace in conscious memory? The most terrifying accounts come from those who've had partial recall, fragments breaking through the amnesia barrier. A man in his 40s began having recurring dreams after a sleepwalker episode where he'd been found 10 miles from his home. In these dreams, he was walking down a road at night, but he wasn't alone. Figures moved alongside him, indistinct shapes that felt present even though he couldn't quite see them. They were guiding him, not forcefully but firmly, keeping him moving toward a destination. The dreams felt like memories trying to surface, his mind attempting to reconstruct what happened during the missing hours. Another woman described waking during a sleepwalking episode to find herself in a field she didn't recognize, paralyzed but conscious, unable to move or call out while lights moved in the sky above her. Then darkness came again, and when she next woke, she was in her bed, with only the dreamlike memory and dirt on her feet to confirm it hadn't been entirely imagination. These fragmentary memories share disturbing elements. Presence of others, though whether these are human, equipment, or entities, remains unclear. Lights, often described as bright and cold, illuminating without casting normal shadows, examination or procedures, sensations of being studied or worked on, physical inspections that leave no obvious marks but linger in body memory, communication without words, information or instructions transmitted directly into the mind, bypassing language and producing compliance without conscious agreement. And always, the overwhelming sense that this is being done for a purpose, that the sleepwalker is serving a function during their missing time, completing tasks or providing services, or undergoing processes that remain completely hidden from their waking awareness. Medical science struggles to explain the phenomenon beyond superficial diagnosis. Yes, these people are sleepwalking in the technical sense that they're moving while not consciously aware. But the distance, complexity, and apparent purpose of their actions exceed anything normal parasomnia should produce. Brain activity during these episodes, when it's been measured through EEG monitoring in controlled settings, shows patterns that don't match either normal sleep or normal waking. It's a third state, consciousness operating in a mode that resembles neither sleep nor wakefulness, but something else, as if the brain has been shifted into a different operational frequency, where external guidance can be received and followed. Theories about what causes sleepwalker episodes range from neurological to paranormal. Some researchers propose it's a dissociative state triggered by trauma or stress, the mind separating from conscious awareness while the body continues functioning on autopilot, traveling to locations that have psychological significance the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. But this doesn't explain the impossible distances, the access to knowledge or abilities the person shouldn't possess, or the clustering in certain locations and families. Others suggest electromagnetic influence, signals or fields that can trigger specific brain states and compel motor activity, essentially remote controlling human bodies through technological means. This would require capability far beyond publicly acknowledged technology, but certainly within the realm of classified research into brain-machine interfaces and neural manipulation. Then there are explanations that venture into territory most scientists refuse to consider seriously. That sleepwalkers are being summoned, called by entities or intelligences that require physical human presence for procedures or purposes we can't comprehend. The person is pulled from sleep into a trance state that allows them to be guided to specific locations where examinations or experiments are conducted, after which their memory is wiped and they're returned or left to be found. This aligns with alien abduction narratives, with the key difference being that sleepwalkers travel under their own power rather than being transported, as if the abducting intelligence prefers or requires the subject to come to them, rather than doing the collecting directly. Some of the most disturbing cases involve sleepwalkers who weren't alone when found. A couple in England both experienced episodes on the same night, waking up together in a church 10 miles from their home, neither with any memory of leaving or traveling. A family of 4 was discovered standing in a field in formation, perfect spacing between them, all facing the same direction, none with any recollection of how they got there or why they were positioned that way. Group sleepwalking shouldn't be possible. There's no mechanism in conventional understanding for multiple people to simultaneously enter trance states and coordinate complex travel and positioning. Yet it happens, suggesting external coordination, something that can affect multiple minds simultaneously and direct them toward shared purpose. There's also the question of what happens to sleepwalkers who are never found. How many people categorized as missing persons are actually sleepwalkers who traveled too far, who reached destinations they couldn't survive, or who encountered something during their episode that ensured they wouldn't return? The majority of sleepwalker incidents we know about are the ones where the person was found and documented. What about the ones where no one witnessed the departure, where the person lived alone, or no one checked on them for days? where they vanished into the night and the trail went completely cold? Are there communities of permanent sleepwalkers somewhere? People who never woke from the trance, who continue serving whatever purpose required them to leave their lives behind? The phenomenon has implications that reach into the core of autonomy and consciousness. If your body can be activated and directed without your awareness or consent, if you can travel miles and perform actions while your conscious mind is completely absent, then what does that say about the nature of consciousness and will? Are we truly in control of ourselves, or is conscious awareness a thin layer riding atop deeper processes that can be accessed and manipulated by those who know how? The sleepwalkers demonstrate that human bodies can be piloted remotely, guided to destinations, and made to perform tasks while the person inside remains unconscious. What percentage of our actions are genuinely autonomous? And what percentage might be influenced or directed by forces we don't perceive? Some victims of repeated episodes report growing fear of sleep itself, the dread of closing their eyes, knowing they might wake up somewhere else, somewhere dangerous, with no memory of how they arrived or what happened while they were there. They try to secure their environments, locks and alarms that should prevent departure, but somehow they still escape, still end up miles away when morning comes. The security measures fail or are bypassed, as if the compulsion overrides physical barriers, as if whatever pulls them out has the capability to ensure they reach the destination regardless of obstacles placed in the way. The missing time is perhaps the cruelest aspect. Hours or days of your life gone, erased, with only your exhausted body and possibly injuries or evidence of travel to confirm that time passed and you were active during it. What did you do? What was done to you? Who did you see or encounter? Your life has been edited, sections removed, and you have to live with knowing there's a gap in your existence that you'll never recover. For some, the not knowing becomes unbearable. They undergo hypnotic regression, desperately trying to recover the memories, and sometimes fragments return, flashes of light, sensation of movement, presence of figures, overwhelming sense of purpose or importance, but nothing that provides clear answers, only hints that make the mystery more disturbing. There are whispers about government interest in the phenomenon, researchers from military or intelligence agencies interviewing sleepwalkers, collecting data, trying to understand or perhaps replicate the mechanism. If human beings can be remotely activated and guided to perform tasks without conscious awareness or memory, the applications for intelligence operations are obvious. Imagine being able to turn anyone into an unwitting courier or observer, having them travel to specific locations, witness or retrieve specific information, and then return with no memory of the operation. They couldn't be interrogated because they genuinely don't know what they've done. They couldn't be compromised because they're unaware they've been used. The perfect asset is one who doesn't know they're an asset. Late at night, in quiet neighborhoods around the world, doors unlock from the inside. Figures in pajamas or nightclothes move through streets with eyes that are open but unseeing, navigating toward destinations they have no conscious intention of reaching. Some will be found in the morning, confused and frightened, their feet dirty and bleeding, their bodies exhausted, their minds blank where hours should be. Some will be found days later, miles away, with no explanation for their journey. And some will never be found at all, will simply vanish into the night and become statistics, missing persons whose families never learn that they walked away not by choice, but by compulsion, called by something that needed them elsewhere for purposes that remain forever hidden. The sleepwalkers move among us, ordinary people who occasionally become puppets, whose bodies are borrowed for tasks their conscious minds never authorize or remember. They are evidence that human autonomy might be far more fragile than we believe, that consciousness might be less in control than we assume. that we can be activated and directed by forces or intelligences that understand our neurology better than we do ourselves. And the most terrifying realization is that you could be a sleepwalker yourself, that episodes might have occurred that you've completely forgotten, that the life you remember living might have gaps you're not aware of, times when something else was using your body while your mind was safely locked away in unconsciousness, kept from witnessing what you were being made to do, kept from remembering the journey, the destination, or whatever was waiting there when you finally arrived. The Smiling Man. Encounters with a being that shouldn't exist. There are certain stories that circulate in whispered tones late at night, accounts that share disturbing similarities despite coming from people who've never met, who live in different cities, different countries, different decades. They describe encountering someone on an empty street in the hollow hours when darkness feels absolute and the normal rules of human interaction seem suspended. This someone walks strangely, moves wrong, and when they see you, when they notice you've seen them, they smile. Not with warmth or recognition or any emotion you can identify. They smile like something performing an action it's observed but doesn't understand, stretching the mouth into a shape that's technically correct but completely, horrifyingly wrong. The smile never reaches the eyes. The eyes remain flat, empty, predatory. And then, depending on the encounter, this being either continues its bizarre movements and disappears into the darkness, or it begins moving toward you with mechanical purpose. That terrible smile locked in place. And you realize with absolute certainty that if it reaches you, something worse than death is going to happen. The most widely shared encounter occurred in Seattle in 2008, posted originally to an online forum by someone who'd experienced something they couldn't rationalize or forget. They described walking home around 2 a.m, sober and alert, through a neighborhood they knew well. The streets were empty, silent. In that particular way, cities become in the dead hours when even ambient sound seems to withdraw. Then they saw him, a tall figure approximately a block away, moving under the streetlights in a manner that immediately registered as wrong. He wasn't walking with the natural rhythm of human gait, the slight bounce and sway that comes from joints and muscles working in coordination. Instead, he moved in lurching steps, limbs bending at angles that seemed exaggerated or incorrect, head tilted at a position that suggested the neck had too many joints, or too few. But he was moving with purpose, advancing down the sidewalk as if performing movement rather than experiencing it. As the witness watched, trying to understand what they were seeing, the figure began dancing. Not dancing the way drunk people stumble and sway, but executing precise, jerking movements. Arms flailing in rigid patterns, legs kicking with mechanical timing, body contorting through poses that looked choreographed by something with only theoretical knowledge of how human bodies move. The witness froze, every instinct screaming that they were observing something deeply wrong, something that wore human form but operated according to different principles. Then the dancing figure noticed them. It stopped mid-movement and turned its head, not rotating the body first the way a person naturally would, but swiveling the head independently, too far, maintaining eye contact that should have been impossible from that angle. And it smiled. The witness described that smile as the most terrifying part of the encounter. The mouth stretched wide, wider than seemed comfortable, showing teeth that were maybe normal or maybe too many, or arranged slightly wrong. The memory became uncertain, as if their mind refused to fully process what they'd seen. But the expression communicated nothing except the mechanical fact of smiling, the performance of an action divorced from any internal state that would generate it. The eyes above that grin remained completely dead, black in the streetlight, reflecting nothing. And then the figure began moving toward them still maintaining that locked smile, limbs jerking in that wrong gait, advancing with clear intention. The witness ran. They described pure animal panic, overriding any rational thought, legs carrying them away as fast as possible, while their mind screamed warnings that they were being pursued by something that shouldn't exist. They didn't look back, couldn't bear to, terrified that they'd see that thing right behind them, that smile hovering in the darkness, impossibly close despite the distance. They ran until they reached their apartment building, fumbled with keys, while expecting at any moment to feel something grab them, and finally got inside and locked the door. Only then did they look through the window toward the street. Nothing. No figure, no movement, no sign that anything had been there at all. Just empty sidewalk under pools of streetlight, silent and ordinary, as if the previous 5 minutes had been hallucination except for the thundering heart and shaking hands that confirmed something had absolutely happened. But this wasn't an isolated incident. After the Seattle account was posted, others came forward with their own encounters, separated by years and geography, but sharing core elements that suggested they'd experienced the same phenomenon. A woman in Virginia described seeing a man dancing strangely on her street in the early morning hours, his movements wrong and jerking, his smile visible even from a distance, frozen and awful. When she retreated into her house and watched through a window, he stood motionless for several minutes, staring at her home, before finally walking away with that same mechanical gait. A man in Australia reported encountering a figure moving bizarrely through a park at night, body contorting through positions that suggested either incredible flexibility or joints that worked differently than human anatomy allowed. When the figure noticed him, it smiled and began approaching, and he fled without understanding why every instinct demanded escape from something that was technically just another person walking in a park. The consistency of the smile across reports is particularly striking. Different witnesses, different circumstances, but the same description of a grin that's technically correct, but fundamentally wrong, that communicates nothing human despite using a human expression. It suggests either a shared archetype in human psychology, something about overly wide smiles triggers instinctive revulsion, or that these witnesses are actually encountering the same type of entity, something that's studied human behavior, enough to know that smiling is a social gesture, but hasn't mastered the subtle elements that make a smile genuine. The muscles are activated in the right sequence, the mouth forms the right shape, but the intention behind it is alien or absent, creating an uncanny valley effect that triggers deep psychological alarms. The movement patterns described across encounters also share disturbing similarities. That jerking mechanical gait, limbs that bend with the right joints but wrong angles, dancing or contorting that looks choreographed rather than spontaneous. It's as if these beings have mapped human movement from observation, but are executing it according to different processing, like animation that's technically accurate, but doesn't capture the fluid reality of organic motion. Some witnesses describe the movement as puppet-like, as if the figure is being controlled by something pulling strings, making it walk and move without fully understanding the physics and coordination that make human locomotion appear natural and effortless. Theories about what the smiling man might be range from the mundane to the terrifying. The most dismissive explanation suggests mentally ill individuals having psychotic episodes, moving strangely because of neurological issues or drug effects, smiling because of inappropriate affect or internal stimulation. People do have psychological breaks that cause bizarre behavior. People do walk streets late at night in altered states. But this explanation struggles with the consistency across independent reports, the specific details that repeat despite witnesses having no contact with each other. and the sheer terror these encounters produce in people who've dealt with disturbed individuals before and can distinguish between someone in crisis and something fundamentally other. Some suggest the encounters involve humans who've been heavily drugged or altered, perhaps victims of mind control experiments or psychological manipulation who've escaped or been released into public spaces to test effects. The mechanical movements could result from neurological damage or hypnotic programming. The smile could be a command they're following, a compulsion to perform a specific expression regardless of context or appropriate emotion. This theory positions the smiling man as victim rather than threat, someone whose humanity has been damaged or removed, leaving a shell that goes through motions without understanding. But it doesn't explain where these individuals come from, who's responsible for their condition, or why they're consistently released onto nighttime streets. Then there are explanations that abandon conventional frameworks entirely, that the smiling man is non-human intelligence wearing a human suit imperfectly, getting most details right but failing at the subtle elements that would make the disguise convincing upon close observation. The smile is an attempted greeting, a gesture copied from observing human interaction, but executed without understanding the emotional context that makes it appropriate. The strange movements reflect operating a body through remote control or unfamiliar interface, like a puppet master still learning how to coordinate the strings. When witnesses flee, the entity follows not from malice, but from curiosity or programmed response. Trying to complete an interaction it doesn't understand is terrifying its target. Other theories suggest interdimensional bleeding, moments when the barriers between realities thin and something from elsewhere slips through into our space. It exists partially in both realities, which is why its movements seem wrong. It's navigating two sets of physical laws simultaneously, making compromises that look bizarre from our perspective. The smile could be its natural expression, meaningful in its dimension, but horrifying in ours. Its awareness of witnesses and pursuit of them might serve purposes we can't comprehend. Collection of energy or information, curiosity about beings it encounters in this foreign reality, or malicious intent operating according to values completely alien to human ethics. There's also speculation about tulpas, or thought forms, entities created by collective belief and fear. The internet age allows stories to spread rapidly, and when thousands of people read about the smiling man, imagine him, visualize him walking through their nightmares. Perhaps they give him form. He becomes real through accumulated psychic energy, manifesting in places where belief is strong and conditions are right. Each encounter feeds the legend, which feeds more belief, which strengthens the entity. He exists in the space between story and reality, sustained by fear and attention, appearing to those who know about him and are unconsciously summoning him through their dread of encountering him. The timing of many encounters, late at night, early morning, the hours between midnight and dawn, suggests something about conditions during that period, makes these manifestations more likely. Perhaps human consciousness operates differently in those hours, becomes more permeable to unusual perceptions, more able to see things that exist outside normal sensory range. Perhaps whatever the smiling man is finds it easier to manifest when fewer observers are present, when reality is less reinforced by collective observation and agreement. The empty streets, the darkness, the silence, these aren't just setting but requirements, conditions that allow something usually invisible to briefly take form and interact with our reality. Witnesses consistently report that encountering the smiling man produces immediate, profound terror that feels instinctive rather than reasoned. Before consciously processing what's wrong with the figure, their bodies are already flooding with adrenaline, preparing for flight, screaming danger through every nerve. This suggests the wrongness operates on a level below conscious thought, triggering evolutionary responses to predators or threats that human ancestors survived by fleeing immediately without stopping to analyze. We've evolved to recognize what's human and what isn't, and when something almost human but not quite appears, every ancient warning system activates at once. The question of what happens if someone doesn't run, if they allow the smiling man to approach and complete whatever interaction he's attempting, remains unanswered because no one who's encountered him has been willing to find out. The few accounts that describe not immediately fleeing report overwhelming psychological pressure to escape, as if staying would result in something worse than physical harm, erasure, replacement, transformation, or simply experiencing something that would break the mind beyond repair. Whether this dread is instinctive protection, psychic warning from the entity itself, or knowledge seeping through from those who failed to escape and no longer exist to tell their story, the result is the same. Everyone runs. Everyone survives the immediate encounter. But what lingers afterward is the certainty that they glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. Something that walks among us in the empty hours, wearing human form like an ill-fitting costume, smiling its terrible smile because it knows that's what humans do when they meet. But nothing about its performance suggests it means greeting or goodwill. Reports continue sporadically, scattered across years and continents. A figure dancing strangely in an empty parking garage in Toronto. A man walking wrong down a German alley at 3 a.m. Someone standing motionless in a Brazilian park, grinning at a passing jogger who felt compelled to sprint away, despite the figure making no move to follow. These accounts appear on forums, in comment sections, in late-night conversations where people share experiences they can't explain. They're never connected officially. No investigation links them. No authority acknowledges a pattern. But those who know the stories recognize the elements, see the consistency, and understand that somewhere in the darkness, in cities around the world, the smiling man continues his inexplicable dance, continues his strange patrol, continues waiting for the next person to notice him so he can turn that terrible grin in their direction and begin his jerking advance toward them through the empty streets, moving like something that learned human motion from instruction manuals, rather than lived experience, smiling because he knows that's what humans do, but has never understood why. The phantom cosmonauts, lost Soviet astronauts, erased from history. In the race to conquer space during the Cold War, when national prestige and ideological superiority were measured in orbital achievements and cosmic firsts, the Soviet Union maintained an information apparatus so tightly controlled that failures could be concealed, disasters could be suppressed, and people could be erased from history as if they had never existed. According to persistent claims that have circulated since the early 1960s, the cosmonauts we know about, Yuri Gagarin, Valentina Tereshkova, Alexei Leonov, were not the first humans the Soviets sent into space, but merely the first to return alive, or the first whose mission succeeded well enough to be publicly acknowledged. Before them, the theory holds, there were others, phantom cosmonauts whose names were recorded in training logs and whose faces appeared in group photographs, who were prepared for missions and launched into the void aboard Vostok capsules or earlier experimental craft, but who died in space or during re-entry or in launch disasters that were too embarrassing to acknowledge, whose bodies were never recovered or were buried in unmarked graves, whose families were told to remain silent, whose records were destroyed or altered, whose very existence was systematically erased from Soviet documentation so thoroughly that decades later, researchers can find only gaps and anomalies where these men and women should be. Only fragmentary evidence that suggests people vanished from the space program in ways that imply not just failed missions, but deliberate historical deletion, leaving us to wonder how many cosmonauts actually died in the Soviet push to reach space first? How many launched and never returned? How many are still up there in orbit? Or drifted off into the solar system? Or burned up on re-entry? Their final moments unrecorded, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their names erased because the Soviet state could not admit failure, could not reveal that the glorious space program had casualties, could not let the world know that in the race to the stars, they had lost people in ways that were preventable or shameful, or that would reveal weaknesses in their technology or their safety protocols, making the phantom cosmonauts either tragic casualties of authoritarian secrecy or elaborate Western propaganda, Cold War mythology designed to cast doubt on Soviet achievements by suggesting that Gagarin wasn't really first because others went before him and died, that every Soviet space triumph was built on undisclosed corpses, that the official history is fiction and the real history was burned or buried, or is still classified in archives that may never be opened, leaving the phantom cosmonauts hovering between documented fact and persistent legend, between probable truth and possible fabrication, between real people who died in space and propaganda. Ghosts that never existed depending on which evidence you accept and which government you trust, and whether you believe that nations competing for supremacy would sacrifice lives in secret and then erase those lives from history to maintain the illusion of perfection in their cosmic achievements. The evidence for phantom cosmonauts comes from multiple sources of varying credibility. The most compelling involves documentation of cosmonauts who appeared in training programs and official photographs, but who later vanished from records without explanation. Soviet group photos from the early space program show individuals who aren't accounted for in later official rosters. People whose faces appear alongside Gagarin, and others in training photos from 1959 or 1960, but who don't appear in any subsequent documentation, who aren't listed as having washed out of the program or transferred to other assignments, who simply stop existing in the historical record as if they were never there despite photographic evidence that they were. Western analysts during the Cold War noticed these disappearances and compiled lists of missing cosmonauts, people who had been publicly associated with the space program, but who vanished without trace. Some were later explained. They had died in non-space related accidents, had been expelled for political reasons, had failed medical examinations. But others had no explanation, no official account of what happened to them, leaving researchers to speculate that they had died in missions that were never acknowledged, that their deaths were covered up because the circumstances were too embarrassing, or because admitting casualties would damage the program's reputation and national prestige. The Giudica Cordiglia brothers, two Italian amateur radio operators, claimed to have intercepted Soviet space communications during the early 1960s that suggested failed missions and cosmonauts in distress. Their recordings allegedly captured conversations between ground control and orbiting cosmonauts who were experiencing system failures, who were off course and unable to return, who were suffocating or burning or drifting away from Earth. The brothers released these recordings publicly, claiming they proved the Soviets were losing cosmonauts and covering up the deaths. The authenticity of the recordings has been disputed. Audio experts have questioned whether they're genuine intercepts or fabrications, whether the Russian spoken in them is authentic or poorly scripted by non-native speakers, whether the technical details match actual Soviet space procedures, or reflect misunderstandings of how the program operated. One of the most famous alleged phantom cosmonauts is Vladimir Ilyushin, son of the renowned Soviet aircraft designer. Rumors circulated in the early 60s that Ilyushin had flown in space before Gagarin in April 1961, but that the mission had gone badly, that he'd landed off course in China and been injured, that the Soviets had concealed this failed mission and then sent Gagarin up in a second attempt that succeeded, allowing them to claim first place in putting a human in orbit, while suppressing the earlier failed attempt. Ilyushin was a real person, was involved in test flying, and did have a serious accident around that time. But the evidence that he flew a secret space mission consists of rumors and circumstantial timing rather than documentation. The Soviets denied it completely, and Ilyushin himself denied it in later interviews, though skeptics note that he would be required to deny it regardless of whether it was true, making his denial less meaningful than it would be in a society with press freedom. Other named candidates for Phantom Cosmonaut status include Alexei Ledovsky, Serenty Shiburin, and Andrei Mitkov, names that appear on Western lists of people who allegedly died in secret Soviet space attempts. The evidence for their space-related deaths is fragmentary and contested. Some appear to be real people who died in aviation or other accidents that weren't space-related. Some might be fabrications or misidentifications. Some might be real cosmonauts who died in ways the Soviets concealed. Without access to complete Soviet archives, determining which is which remains extremely difficult. The Nedelin catastrophe in October 1960 is documented fact that demonstrates the Soviets were willing to conceal massive disasters. During preparations for a missile launch, an explosion killed at least 92 people, including Marshal Mitrofen Nedelin. The Soviets suppressed this disaster completely for decades, eventually acknowledging it only after the Soviet Union collapsed. If they could conceal a disaster that killed nearly 100 people, including high-ranking officials, concealing individual cosmonaut deaths would be comparatively easy. The Nedelin catastrophe proves that the Soviet state had both the capability and the willingness to suppress space program casualties, validating the plausibility of phantom cosmonaut claims, even if specific cases remain unproven. The Valentin Bondarenko case provides another documented example of suppressed space program death. Bondarenko was a trainee cosmonaut who died in a training accident in March 1961, burned to death in a low-pressure chamber fire. The Soviets concealed his death until 1986, leaving him off official cosmonaut rosters for decades, despite him having been a genuine member of the program who died in space-related training. His case demonstrates that the Soviets did erase cosmonauts who died in embarrassing circumstances, that they did maintain false historical records that omitted inconvenient casualties, that the practice of creating phantom cosmonauts through suppression and erasure was documented policy rather than mere speculation. The question is how extensive this practice was. Was Bondarenko an isolated case, or did the Soviets systematically suppress all space program deaths prior to Glasnost? Did cosmonauts die in orbit and have their missions erased from history? Are their bodies still in space, or scattered across Soviet territory from failed missions that were never acknowledged? Or were most of the phantom cosmonaut stories Western propaganda, Cold War fabrications designed to undermine Soviet space achievements by suggesting they were built on concealed corpses? The technical plausibility is significant. The early Vostok program was extraordinarily dangerous. The capsules had no abort systems during launch. If the rocket failed, the cosmonaut would die. The re-entry systems were primitive. The landing procedures were crude. The life support systems were minimal. Gagarin's successful flight was remarkable, partly because so many things could have gone wrong. That subsequent Vostok flights had no failures seems statistically unlikely given the technology's immaturity and the rushed schedule driven by political pressure to maintain Soviet leads over the Americans. It's entirely plausible that some missions failed catastrophically, that some cosmonauts died, and that these deaths were concealed. The Soviet system's opacity makes verification nearly impossible. During the Cold War, Western intelligence agencies devoted enormous resources to monitoring Soviet space activities, using radio intercepts, satellite reconnaissance, defector testimony, and other methods to piece together what was happening. Some phantom cosmonaut claims originate from intelligence assessments, from Western agencies noticing discrepancies and unexplained gaps in Soviet documentation. But intelligence agencies also engaged in disinformation, creating false narratives to discredit adversaries, meaning that claims from these sources have to be evaluated carefully for potential propaganda motives. The post-Soviet archival openness has been limited. While some previously classified information has been released since the USSR's collapse, much remains restricted, and some records were apparently destroyed. Researchers who've accessed Soviet space program archives report finding evidence of accidents and deaths that weren't publicly acknowledged, but also finding that some records that should exist are missing, suggesting either deliberate destruction or that they're still held in classified collections. The incomplete archival access means we can't definitively prove or disprove most phantom cosmonaut claims through documentary research. The cultural and psychological dimensions are important. The Soviet Union's self-image as technologically advanced and ideologically superior created pressure to present an unblemished record of space achievements. Admitting failures, acknowledging casualties, revealing technical problems would contradict the narrative of Soviet excellence and might be seen as betraying the state and the ideology it represented. Cosmonauts and their families lived within this system, understanding that speaking about failures or deaths could bring severe consequences, that silence and complicity in historical erasure might be necessary for survival and for protecting one's family. The contrast with the American approach is striking. The US space program operated in a society with press freedom and political opposition, making complete suppression of disasters impossible. The Apollo 1 fire that killed Grissom, White, and Chaffee was publicly acknowledged immediately, investigated extensively, with findings published and used to improve safety. The Challenger and Columbia disasters were broadcast live or documented immediately, with transparent investigations and public accountability. This transparency created different cultural memory around space program casualties. They're commemorated, memorialized, acknowledged as sacrifices rather than erasures. Whether this reflects genuinely different philosophies about human life and accountability, or merely different propaganda strategies, acknowledging casualties publicly versus concealing them remains debatable. If phantom cosmonauts existed, if men and women died in space and were erased from history, the moral implications are profound. They were sacrificed for national prestige, their deaths concealed to maintain propaganda narratives, their families forced into silence, their very existence denied so that the Soviet state could present unblemished record of success. They died serving their country in the most extreme exploration humans had attempted. And rather than being honored, they were erased, treated as embarrassments to be hidden, problems to be solved through suppression, rather than acknowledged as inevitable casualties of pioneering dangerous territory. The question of whether bodies remain in orbit is haunting. If cosmonauts died during orbital missions and recovery was impossible or was never attempted, their remains might still be in space, orbiting Earth in dead capsules, gradually decaying orbits until eventual re-entry and incineration, or perhaps ejected into higher orbits where they'll circle for centuries. Phantom spacecraft containing phantom cosmonauts, physical evidence of suppressed history silently orbiting above, occasionally visible to tracking systems that record them as debris without knowing what they really are. The verification challenges mean the phantom cosmonauts will likely remain ambiguous. We can document that some people associated with the space program disappeared from records. We can prove that the Soviets did suppress casualties like Bondarenko. We can demonstrate through Nedelin that massive disasters were concealed. but proving that specific individuals died in specific space missions that were then erased from history requires documentation that might not exist, or that remains classified, or that was destroyed, leaving us with high probability that some phantom cosmonauts are real, that some Soviet space deaths were concealed, but without ability to definitively identify individuals or reconstruct suppressed missions in detail. The phantom cosmonauts represent the dark side of space exploration, the casualties and failures that accompanied the triumphant narrative of humans reaching orbit, and eventually the moon. They remind us that the space race was competition conducted under Cold War pressures, where propaganda value sometimes outweighed safety, where political considerations influenced technical decisions, where human lives were risked and sometimes lost in pursuit of national prestige. Whether the specific claims about individual phantom cosmonauts are accurate or not, the broader truth that early space exploration was dangerous and that some of those dangers resulted in deaths that were concealed is well established. As the Soviet archives continue to be studied and as more information emerges through defectors and declassification, we may eventually have clearer picture of who died in the Soviet space program and which deaths were concealed and why. But barring complete transparency, which seems unlikely given ongoing political sensitivities and national pride, the phantom cosmonauts will remain hovering between history and legend, between documented fact and persistent rumor. Real people who died and were erased, and people who never existed except in Western propaganda designed to tarnish Soviet achievements, leaving us with questions that may never be fully answered, with names on lists that might be casualties or might be fabrications, with photographic evidence of people who vanished from records in ways that suggest erasure, but that might have innocent explanations, with a certainty that some concealment occurred, but uncertainty about its extent, with knowledge that the Soviets did suppress space program deaths, but ambiguity about how many and which ones, leaving the phantom cosmonauts in permanent liminal status, neither fully proven nor fully disproven, neither definitely real nor definitely fictional, existing in that uncertain space where Cold War secrecy meets contemporary historical investigation, where authoritarian information control meets Western skepticism and research, where the victims of suppressed disasters exist as possibilities and probabilities, rather than as documented certainties, where men and women who may have died in space remain unacknowledged, unmemorialized, erased from history. Except for the fragmentary evidence that suggests they existed, that suggests they died, that suggests their deaths were too embarrassing or too revealing to acknowledge, making them phantom cosmonauts in the most literal sense, present in shadow evidence, and suggestive gaps, but absent from official records, existing in the spaces between documents, in the silences where names should be, in the photographs where faces appear and then disappear from later versions, in the persistent claims and occasional discoveries that keep the questions alive, that prevent definitive conclusion that all Soviet space deaths were acknowledged, that maintain the possibility, and perhaps the probability, that some cosmonauts died in space and were simply erased, that their families were silenced, that their sacrifices went uncommemorated because the Soviet state valued propaganda narrative over truth, valued the appearance of perfection over acknowledgement of human cost, valued ideology over individuals, making the phantom cosmonauts the missing names in space exploration history. The unacknowledged casualties of the race to orbit, the people who may have died reaching for the stars, and who were repaid with erasure, with suppression, with being turned into ghosts in their own history, existing now only as persistent questions, as fragmentary evidence, as the phantom cosmonauts who haunt space history, who remind us that exploration has costs that aren't always acknowledged, that authoritarianism creates silences where testimony should be, that some sacrifices are honored while others are buried, and that decades later, we still don't know with certainty how many people the Soviet Union lost in space, or how many names should be added to the memorial of those who died exploring beyond Earth, leaving the phantom cosmonauts as they are, and perhaps as they'll always be. Possibly real, possibly fictional, definitely unresolved, perpetually hovering in the uncertain space between documented history and suppressed truth, between Cold War propaganda and authoritarian concealment, between the cosmos they may have reached and the erasure they definitely received. Phantom cosmonauts whose existence or non-existence remains one of space exploration's enduring mysteries. The Seven Trumpets, apocalyptic sounds heard around the world. Starting around 2011, people across the globe began recording and reporting something that shouldn't be possible, something that has no conventional explanation, and that continues sporadically to this day. They describe hearing sounds from the sky that resemble trumpets or horns, massive and resonant, as if something enormous is blowing instruments that dwarf anything humans have ever constructed. The sounds last for minutes, sometimes longer, reverberating through the air with such power that windows rattle and the ground seems to vibrate. They've been recorded in Canada, Ukraine, Germany, Belarus, Malaysia, Indonesia, across the United States, in cities and rural areas, heard by thousands of witnesses simultaneously, captured on countless videos that document the same bizarre phenomenon. The sky is making noise that sounds biblical, apocalyptic, like the trumpet blasts described in Revelation that herald the end of the world. And no government, no scientific institution, no authority has provided an explanation that accounts for all the characteristics these sounds display, leaving people to wonder what's actually producing them, whether they're natural phenomena we don't understand, technological operations we're not supposed to know about, or something far stranger. Signs that whatever the Book of Revelation described might actually be beginning, that we're hearing the literal trumpets that announce the apocalypse, and that everything we've dismissed as religious mythology might be terrifyingly, impossibly real. The sounds themselves are deeply unsettling, even through recordings, and witnesses describe them as far more impactful in person. They're low frequency, resonant, creating harmonics that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The tone shifts and modulates, sometimes sounding like a single sustained note, other times like multiple horns playing together in dissonant chords that create tension and unease. The volume is inconsistent. Sometimes they're heard across entire cities, other times only in specific neighborhoods, but they're always loud enough to be unmistakable, to stop people in their tracks and make them look up at the sky trying to identify the source. And critically, there's no visible origin. No aircraft, no obvious industrial source, no identifiable equipment producing the sound. It just emanates from the sky itself, as if the atmosphere has become an instrument, as if something massive and invisible is using the air as a medium to broadcast these tones. The biblical connection is immediate and unavoidable for anyone familiar with Revelation. The book describes 7 angels with 7 trumpets, each blast bringing specific catastrophes. Hail and fire mixed with blood, mountains thrown into the sea, stars falling from heaven, darkness covering the sun and moon, locusts tormenting those without God's seal, an army released to kill 1/3 of humanity, and finally the kingdom of God proclaimed. These descriptions have been interpreted symbolically for centuries, understood as metaphorical representations of divine judgment. But when people hear sounds from the sky that literally resemble trumpets, that occur without explanation in the years when global catastrophes, pandemics, economic collapse, environmental disasters, wars seem to be accelerating the symbolic interpretation becomes harder to maintain. What if revelation wasn't metaphor? What if ancient prophets were describing actual future events using the only language and framework they had available? What if we're living through the sequence they documented, and these sounds are exactly what they claim to be? Angels announcing each stage of the end times. The first widely reported incident occurred in Kiev, Ukraine, in August 2011. A video went viral showing a typical urban scene suddenly interrupted by a massive sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A droning horn-like tone that lasted over a minute while people looked around in confusion and fear. The video's authenticity was immediately questioned. Was it CGI? Was the sound added in post-production? Was it viral marketing for a movie? But then more videos appeared from different locations around the world, each showing the same type of phenomenon. Normal day interrupted by inexplicable trumpet sounds from the sky. Different cameras, different locations, different witnesses, but the sound was consistent enough that it couldn't all be fabrication or coincidence. Explanations offered by authorities and scientists have been varied and inconsistent, which itself raises suspicion. Some officials claim the sounds were construction equipment, industrial machinery, or trains, but witnesses in rural areas, far from any such sources, reported identical sounds. Others suggested atmospheric phenomena: thunder, wind moving through specific cloud formations, temperature inversions causing sound to carry from distant sources. But the sounds occur in clear weather. They don't match known atmospheric audio phenomena, and they demonstrate characteristics like sustained tones and harmonic complexity that natural processes don't typically produce. NASA suggested the sounds might be background noise from Earth itself, electromagnetic radiation from the atmosphere being converted to audio frequencies. But this doesn't explain why the phenomenon only began appearing in recordings around 2011, why it's intermittent rather than constant, or why it has the specific tonal qualities of instruments rather than natural ambient noise. Some researchers have proposed the sounds are generated by geological activity, the Earth's crust shifting and resonating in ways that produce audible frequencies. Earthquakes and tectonic movement do generate infrasound and occasionally audible groaning or rumbling. But the trumpet sounds occur in geologically stable areas with no corresponding seismic activity. They also have musical qualities, sustained notes, chord progressions, rhythmic patterns that random geological stress wouldn't create. Rock doesn't produce harmonics that sound like brass instruments unless something is deliberately using the rock as part of an acoustic system designed to create that effect. Then there are technological explanations that venture into conspiracy territory. HAARP, the High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program in Alaska, has been accused of creating the sounds through electromagnetic manipulation of the ionosphere. The theory holds that directed energy beams interacting with atmospheric layers could produce audible effects, either as byproduct of whatever experiments are being conducted, or as intentional sonic manipulation for purposes that remain classified. The project has been associated with weather modification, earthquake generation, and consciousness manipulation, so producing sounds in the sky would fit within its alleged capabilities. However, HAARP's actual acknowledged purpose is ionospheric research, and the facility's staff deny any capability to produce the effects attributed to them. But classified programs by definition aren't publicly acknowledged, and if HAARP or similar installations were conducting experiments that produced audible side effects, denial would be expected. Other technological theories propose the sounds are related to underground drilling, fracking operations, or construction of deep underground bases and tunnel systems. Massive boring machines operating at depth could theoretically produce vibrations that resonate through geological layers and emerge at the surface as audible sound. But this doesn't explain why the sounds appear to come from the sky rather than the ground, why they're heard in areas with no known underground construction, or why they have the specific timbral qualities they demonstrate, unless the underground operations are far more extensive than publicly known, extending beneath virtually every location where sounds have been reported. This explanation struggles to account for the global distribution of the phenomenon. There's also speculation about secret aerospace programs, advanced aircraft or spacecraft, using propulsion systems that generate unusual acoustic signatures. If classified vehicles are being tested that operate on principles beyond conventional jet or rocket technology, they might produce sounds unlike anything in the public aerospace catalog. The lack of visual confirmation could be explained by stealth capabilities, by operations conducted at altitudes or in conditions where the craft isn't visible, or by technologies that render vehicles effectively invisible while still producing audible effects. This would explain why governments haven't provided clear answers. Acknowledging the sounds would require acknowledging the aircraft producing them, revealing capabilities they want to keep secret. But all of these explanations feel insufficient when you listen to the recordings and read witness accounts. The sounds don't behave like any known natural or technological source. They appear without warning, last for variable durations, sometimes include what witnesses describe as multiple voices, playing simultaneously in harmony or dissonance, and then stop as suddenly as they started. There's an intentional quality to them, a sense that they're being played rather than randomly generated, that something is producing these tones deliberately for purposes we can only speculate about. The pattern of occurrence also defies easy explanation. The sounds appear in clusters temporally, periods of weeks or months where reports surge globally, then long periods of silence. They don't correlate obviously with any natural cycles, astronomical events, or known technological operations. They seem almost random, except that randomness itself might be the pattern. The unpredictability keeping populations uncertain and unable to adapt or dismiss the phenomenon as routine. If you knew the sounds would occur every Tuesday at 3 p.m., you'd adjust and stop finding them remarkable. But when they can happen anytime, anywhere, they maintain their power to disturb and frighten, to remind people that something is occurring that we don't control and don't understand. Witness reactions are remarkably consistent across cultures and locations. People describe feeling profound unease, not just from the strangeness of the sound, but from something about its quality that triggers instinctive fear responses. Some report the sound makes them think immediately of divine judgment, of end times, even if they're not particularly religious. Others describe feeling that they're hearing something they're not supposed to hear, that the sounds are meant for something other than human ears, and we're just accidentally picking them up. Many report that the sounds affect them physically: pressure in the chest, difficulty breathing, nausea, disorientation, suggesting frequencies or volumes that interact with human physiology in ways that go beyond simple auditory perception. Children seem particularly affected, becoming frightened or distressed when the sounds occur, sometimes claiming they can hear elements in the sounds that adults don't perceive. Animals also react strangely: dogs barking frantically, birds falling silent, livestock becoming agitated. This suggests the sounds might contain frequency components outside normal human hearing range that animals and children, whose hearing extends to different ranges, can detect. What we're consciously hearing might be only part of what's actually being broadcast, with infrasound or ultrasound components carrying additional information or producing effects we're not consciously aware of. The religious interpretation remains powerful despite efforts to find scientific explanations. For believers in biblical prophecy, The sounds are exactly what Revelation describes, literal trumpets being blown in heaven that we're hearing on earth, announcements of each stage of apocalyptic sequence. The fact that they began appearing around 2011, a period when many eschatological timelines predicted increased activity leading toward end times, adds weight to this interpretation. The sounds could be warnings, announcements that the prophesied events are beginning, calls for humanity to repent or prepare for what's coming. In this framework, the lack of scientific explanation isn't a mystery to be solved, but expected. Divine phenomena wouldn't be explainable through human science, wouldn't reduce to natural or technological causes because they're supernatural by nature. There are also theories that blend scientific and spiritual frameworks, suggesting the sounds represent dimensional bleeding or reality shifts. If the barrier between our dimension and others is weakening, if multiple realities are beginning to overlap, then we might be hearing sounds from adjacent dimensions, the acoustic environment of spaces that exist parallel to ours becoming briefly audible when conditions align. The trumpet-like quality could be actual instruments being played in those dimensions, or it could be how our brains interpret frequencies that don't translate cleanly into our acoustic reality. The closest match our auditory processing can find for sounds that don't properly exist in our dimensional framework. Skeptics correctly point out that the phenomenon could be entirely fabricated, viral hoaxes spreading through social media, people adding sounds to videos, or misidentifying mundane sources as mysterious trumpets. Some videos have been proven fake, using audio from movies or synthetic effects. But this doesn't account for the videos that include multiple witnesses reacting in real time, for the recordings made by different people in the same location, capturing the same sounds from different angles, or for the witnesses who've reported the sounds to local authorities and media before any videos appeared online. Hoaxes exist, but dismissing all reports as fabrication requires believing in coordinated global deception involving thousands of participants with no apparent motive or organization. The silence from official sources is perhaps most telling. When pressed, authorities offer vague explanations that don't withstand scrutiny, or they simply decline to comment, treating the phenomenon as not worthy of serious investigation. For something that's been reported globally for over a decade, that's been captured on thousands of recordings, that's witnessed by credible observers including police, military personnel, and scientists. The lack of comprehensive investigation is strange. Either authorities genuinely don't know what's causing the sounds and don't want to admit their ignorance, or they know exactly what's causing them and have decided the truth can't be made public. That revealing the source would create more problems than maintaining the mystery. What we're left with is a phenomenon that continues, that appears randomly across the world, that sounds like biblical trumpets announcing apocalypse, that has no agreed-upon explanation despite occurring in an age of sophisticated monitoring technology and scientific understanding. Whether these are natural processes we haven't identified, technological operations we're not supposed to know about, psychological warfare being conducted on global populations, dimensional anomalies becoming audible as reality structures shift, or actual divine heralds announcing stages of prophesied end times, the sounds persist and the mystery deepens. And every time a new recording appears, every time someone reports hearing the trumpets in their city, in their neighborhood, in the sky above their home, people remember the biblical descriptions, remember that the end times were supposed to be announced exactly this way, with trumpets from heaven that everyone would hear, with signs so obvious that no one could claim they weren't warned. And they wonder if perhaps the ancient prophets knew exactly what they were talking about, if the sounds we're dismissing as atmospheric phenomena or hoaxes are actually the literal fulfillment of apocalyptic prophecy. The 7 angels with 7 trumpets beginning their sequence, each blast bringing us closer to whatever ending or transformation has been written in the cosmic schedule since before humanity began keeping time, announced now in tones that resonate through the atmosphere like instruments played by something vast enough to use the sky itself as concert hall, broadcasting to everyone regardless of belief or readiness. The message that whatever was prophesied is beginning, that the trumpets are sounding, and that time, as we've known it, is running toward its conclusion, announced in notes that echo across the world, like warnings we're refusing to fully hear. Quantum immortality. You've died many times but keep shifting. There's a disturbing philosophical implication of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. A thought experiment that, if taken seriously, suggests that from your subjective perspective, you can never actually experience death, that every time you face a potentially fatal situation, a car accident where you should have died, an illness that should have been terminal, a moment of danger where survival required improbable luck, you don't experience the timelines where you die because dead observers can't experience anything, but instead your consciousness continues only in the quantum branches where you survived, no matter how improbable those branches become, creating situation where from your internal perspective, you're functionally immortal, always finding yourself in the timeline where you lived, where the cancer went into unexpected remission, where the bullet missed by inches, where the accident that killed others somehow spared you, where improbable survival after improbable survival accumulates until you begin to notice that you've been extraordinarily lucky, that you've survived things you shouldn't have survived, that people around you die in circumstances similar to ones you've experienced, but somehow you always make it through, suggesting that you've actually died many times in other quantum branches. But your consciousness only persists in the branches where you survived, where you're still experiencing reality, where you continue to exist no matter how unlikely your continued existence becomes from external statistical perspective, making you quantum immortal from your subjective viewpoint. Even though in the vast majority of quantum branches you're dead, even though most versions of you died in that car accident, or from that disease, or in that moment of danger. But the versions that died aren't experiencing anything anymore, aren't continuing in any timeline, while you, the experiencing subject reading this, only exist in timelines where you survived, creating anthropic selection effect where your continued existence proves nothing about how likely your survival was. Only that in the timeline you're experiencing, you survived, because that's the only kind of timeline you could be experiencing, because dead versions of you aren't experiencing timelines where they died, making death impossible to experience, even though it's constantly occurring in adjacent quantum branches, leaving you immortal from your perspective while mortal from everyone else's perspective, creating bizarre asymmetry where you can watch others die, can experience their permanent absence, but can never experience your own death. Because the moment you would die, your consciousness simply continues, only in branches where you didn't, where something improbable saved you, where quantum probability happened to break in the direction that preserved your existence. And if this pattern continues indefinitely, you should expect your subjective experience to become increasingly improbable, to involve more and more unlikely survivals, more and more situations where everyone around you is asking how you made it through, where your continued existence becomes statistically anomalous, where you start to notice that you're the luckiest person you know, that you've survived situations that killed others. That probability seems to bend in your favor in ways that would be remarkable if you were just one person in one timeline. But that makes perfect sense if you're one consciousness experiencing only the subset of quantum branches, where you survived while being oblivious to the vastly more numerous branches where you died, making quantum immortality simultaneously comforting. You never experience death, and disturbing. Everyone you know will eventually die from your perspective, while you continue on in increasingly improbable timelines, potentially watching the universe age around you while you persist, because there's always some quantum branch, no matter how unlikely, where you survive another day, where your consciousness shifts to another improbable survival, where death remains forever in your future, never in your experienced present, making quantum immortality less about living forever and more about being trapped in consciousness that can't experience its own ending, that shifts between timelines without knowing it's shifting, that mistakes its string of improbable survivals for luck or divine protection or simple persistence when it might actually be quantum mechanical necessity, might be the inescapable consequence of consciousness only being able to experience timelines where it exists, leaving you to wonder whether the close calls you've had, the near misses, and the unexpected recoveries were actually close calls where you barely survived in this timeline, or whether they were deaths in other timelines that you only remember from the surviving side, whether you've already died 100 times, but your consciousness only exists in branches where you didn't, making this timeline, this moment, this continuation of experience just one of infinitely many quantum branches, but the only one you can experience because all the others where you died aren't available to you, aren't experienceable by you, aren't part of your subjective reality, no matter how objectively real they are in the multiverse, leaving you immortal until you're not, until the final death that occurs across all remaining quantum branches simultaneously, until the moment when no branches remain where you survive, which if you're young and healthy, might be decades or centuries in your subjective future, but which if you're old or sick, might be imminent, might be approaching as the set of possible survival branches narrows, as probability constrains the multiverse toward outcomes where your continued existence becomes impossible across all branches, where quantum immortality finally ends, not because you experience death, but because there are no more branches for your consciousness to shift to. No more improbable survivals available. No more quantum timelines where you continue, leaving you to wonder whether every moment of continued existence is a shift, is a death survived in other branches, is a consciousness that persists only because it must persist in any timeline where it experiences anything at all, making you simultaneously mortal and immortal, depending on which perspective you take. Mortal from outside, where observers see you age and eventually die. Immortal from inside, where you experience nothing but continuation, nothing but survival, nothing but the next moment and the next, each one representing a quantum branch where you still exist, while innumerable branches where you died proceed without you, without your consciousness, without your subjective experience of their reality, leaving quantum immortality as either profound truth about the nature of conscious experience in many worlds' universe, or as philosophical confusion about what consciousness and death actually mean, or as both simultaneously, a framework that might be descriptively accurate about your subjective experience, even if it doesn't change the objective reality of your mortality, doesn't prevent your death in most branches, doesn't save you from aging and entropy and the eventual heat death of the universe. But that does predict and explain the pattern of your subjective experience. The fact that you're alive right now, to read this, that you've survived every danger you've faced so far, that you're experiencing continuation, which is exactly what quantum immortality predicts you'll always experience until the very end, until all branches close, until the shifting stops, leaving you to wonder in every moment whether you just survived something in another branch, whether the life you're living is the improbable one, whether you're immortal in the only way that matters, subjectively, experientially, continuously, unable to experience the deaths that are happening to you across the multiverse, because you only exist where you exist, only persist where you persist, only shift between the branches where you're alive to shift, making quantum immortality not a gift, but a description, not salvation, but explanation, not eternal life, but subjective inability to experience anything except life continuing, moment after moment, breath after breath, shift after shift between quantum branches you'll never know you're shifting between. Deaths you'll never know you died. Survivals you'll never know were improbable. Until the end, whenever and however that comes, in the final moment that closes all branches, that makes continuation impossible, that ends the shifting and ends the immortality and ends the consciousness that could only ever experience its own continuation, never its own cessation, making you functionally immortal until you're not, quantum protected until you're not, continuously experiencing life until experience itself ends, leaving quantum immortality as either the most profound truth about conscious existence or the most elaborate philosophical confusion about what death means and what consciousness is, and whether subjective experience in many worlds' universe really does create functional immortality from internal perspective, even while objective mortality proceeds normally from external perspective, leaving you, the conscious experiencer reading this, surviving this moment, existing in this branch, to wonder whether you've already died 1,000 times, but only remember the survivals, whether the close calls were closer than you think, whether you're immortal in the only way a conscious being can be immortal, by never experiencing anything except the continuation of experience, the persistence of awareness, the next moment arriving after this one, in an unbroken chain that feels like it could never end, even though it will, even though it must, even though quantum immortality isn't really immortality, but just the observer selection effect that guarantees you only experience timelines where you're alive to experience them, making every moment of your life a triumph of improbable survival, a shift to the branch where you persist, a continuation that's simultaneously inevitable from your perspective and unlikely from the multiverse's perspective, leaving you alive, conscious, reading this, experiencing this moment in the quantum branch where you survived to experience it, while other versions of you in other branches didn't survive, aren't reading this, aren't experiencing anything, aren't part of your subjective reality, aren't available to you, leaving only this, only now, only the continuous experience of being alive in the branches where you're alive, immortal until the final death. Quantum protected until all branches close, shifting between possibilities until no possibilities remain, making quantum immortality both true and meaningless, both profound and trivial, both the most important fact about your existence and completely irrelevant to how you live. Because whether you're shifting between branches or simply living in one, whether you've died 1,000 times or never died at all, the subjective experience is identical. You're here, now, alive, conscious, experiencing this moment, unable to experience any moment where you're not, making quantum immortality simultaneously the deepest truth about consciousness and the most obvious tautology. You experience being alive because that's the only thing you can experience. You survive every danger from your perspective because dead perspectives don't persist. You're immortal until you're not, quantum protected until protection ends, shifting through branches of survival until no branches remain. And then, in that final moment that you'll never experience, quantum immortality ends, the shifting stops, consciousness ceases, and the immortality that was never really, immortality reveals itself as just the observer selection effect applied to consciousness across many worlds, leaving you, while you exist, while you shift, while you survive, functionally immortal, subjectively unkillable, continuously experiencing life, because that's the only thing consciousness can do. Persist in the branches where it persists, shift to the survivals, experience the continuations, Be alive in all the ways that matter for as long as any branches remain, where being alive is possible, making you quantum immortal. Right now, in this moment, for as long as this moment lasts, for as long as the branches remain open, for as long as consciousness continues to shift between the survivals that define your subjective experience of reality, leaving quantum immortality as either profound truth or philosophical confusion, or both, either comfort or horror, or both, either the secret of eternal life or just the tautology that you're alive right now and can only experience timelines where you're alive, making you immortal in the only way consciousness can be immortal. By never experiencing its own ending, by always finding itself in the next moment, by shifting through quantum branches without knowing it's shifting, dying in other timelines without knowing it's dying, surviving by necessity in the only timeline it can experience. This one, right now, where you're alive, reading this, contemplating quantum immortality, wondering whether you've already died and shifted, whether the close calls were deaths elsewhere, whether you're immortal or just lucky, or whether those are the same thing in many worlds universe, where consciousness persists only where it persists, making quantum immortality true by definition and trivial by implication, both everything and nothing, both the deepest mystery of existence and the most obvious feature of subjective experience, leaving you, the eternal experiencer, the quantum survivor, the consciousness that shifts, alive until the final shift, immortal until immortality ends, experiencing life because that's all you can experience, in the quantum branches where you survived to experience anything at all.